Hey everybody, Jennifer Schaus here. We're coming to you live today from Washington, DC, and thanks for joining us in our webinar series. This year in 2024, we are covering the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, and we're glad that everybody is here with us today. We've got a lot of content to get through, so let's go ahead and move on. So as mentioned, the webinar series is covering the FAR. This is going to be held every Wednesday and Friday at noon Eastern. If there's a federal holiday, we will skip over that day. All of our webinars are complimentary and recorded. You can find them on our YouTube channel, which has over 650 government contracting webinars with over 7,000 subscribers. And our PowerPoints get posted on slideshare.net. You can log into slideshare.net with your LinkedIn credentials. It doesn't cost you anything. To sign up for the series, it's on our website under the section called the FAR. And the recordings will be listed there as well. We did cover the FAR in 2020, but that's been 4 years, so the regulations and rules have been, for some of the parts, have been changed. So in the event that you're anxious to get to a certain part that we have yet to cover, if you go back to 2020, just be mindful that some of the information that you're looking at there from those webinars or PowerPoints could be a little bit out of date. We've also covered the DFARS and FAR supplements. DFARS was 2021 and FAR supplements was 2022. Next year, we're hoping to cover the DFARS, so that should be 2025. A little bit about us. We do provide professional services consulting for established government contractors. This primarily is focused on GSA schedules and other contract vehicles, but all of our services are listed on our website under the About Us section. If anyone is selling to government contractors, you can send us an email and ask for our media kit. We've got advertising opportunities in our newsletter, in the webinar series, including this one currently. We also offer event sponsorship and social media advertising in LinkedIn. We're putting on a webinar at the end of this month on Thursday, March 28th, with our friends over at the Western Michigan Apex Accelerator. I was going to say PTAC, but they've all changed their names. It's a complimentary webinar. You can register for this on our website under the section called Events. Even though this is a webinar, it's found under the Events section of our website. You can probably also register on the Western Michigan apex.org site. If you're looking for help with DHS tax or NESA soup, shoot us an email and we can help with that. And then some sponsored content webinars. We've got a pretty busy March coming up. This, I believe, is next week or the week after. I think it's next week, actually, yes. Tuesday is using the federal forecasting app to build relationships. That same week, then on Thursday, our friends over at Agile ATS are putting on a webinar about recruiting strategies. And then at the end of the month, Tuesday the 26th, is My GovWatch has conducted a survey of federal contracting officers, and they've got some great information to share with you. These are all complimentary. Also on our website under the event section. A little further out in June, Carrie Palmatier is putting on a two-part series covering SBIRs, which is, I think, a underrated topic in government contracting, so please join us. Those, again, are also complimentary. The links to register are on our website under the event section, even though these are webinars. Okay, and now we want to thank our sponsors. Our sponsors allow our webinars to be complimentary, posted to our YouTube channel and all of that. So just keep that in mind and give some love to some of these folks. So we want to thank our friends at GovEvents. That's the premier platform for posting events related to government contracting. You can find all of our webinars and our events on govevents.com, as well as recordings from our past 600+ webinars. We also want to thank Tom Johnson and his team at Set Aside Alert. That's the go-to publication for contracting opportunities for small, women-owned, veteran-owned, hub-zone, and 8A firms. Visit setasidealert.com for more information. The Fairfax Economic Development Authority has an online calendar of events and webinars, and we want to thank them for posting our events and webinars on their calendar. The Virginia Apex Accelerator is over at George Mason University. They offer free one-on-one counseling to established government contracting firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. If you're interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore services, review homework recommendation, register for live training, and find useful links to agencies and other self-directed learning. One-on-one counseling is limited to eligible client companies. Appointment requests are handled in the order they are received and based on counselor availability due to very high demand. Their online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. The Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce has a monthly government contracting meeting. It's always the last Tuesday of the month, so that's coming up on Tuesday, March 26th. Runs for an hour over at the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce conference room. If you've got questions, please contact Alicia Field. Her email is there at the bottom of the screen. BidSpeed, do you want help winning government contracts? BidSpeed can help. Users can find bidding opportunities from federal, state, and local government. Additionally, you can search for teaming partners, incumbent point of contact, expiring contracts, compliance matrices, and other proposal templates. Create your login today at bidspeed.com. BidSpeed is an official partner of the U.S. SBA 7J Management and Technical Assistance Program. The FBC events are the ultimate engagement channel to bring government and industry together. 68% of government personnel report that they attend more than one event each year. FBC has worked with government and industry for 45 plus years to create gatherings where ideas are shared and to help government achieve its goals. This includes agency industry days, cybersecurity symposiums, tech expos, and off-site meetings. FBC provides full lifecycle meeting planning and event management. With over 5,000 meetings under their belt, FBC has the experience, systems, and personnel to make your next event exceptional. Learn more at fbcinc.com. GovBrew, please check out our friends at GovBrew. GovBrew is the most read government contracting newsletter, keeping thousands of government contracting professionals in the loop with news, updates, and opportunities in the federal contracting market, all in a fun and accessible email that only takes 5 minutes to read. It's 100% free to join. Goes out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 a.m. It's filled with great content, event postings, webinars, and more. We encourage you to sign up at govbrew.co, or you can use the QR code you see on the screen. Okay, the reason that we're here today is to cover the FAR Part 12. We've got our friend Sam Knowles over at DLA Piper. I believe he is the co-chair, if I'm not mistaken, of the government contracts group. Sam, I'm going to put myself on mute. We really appreciate you being here with us and putting together these slides and sharing your time with us. And I'll turn the floor over to you now.
Great. Thanks so much, Jennifer. Sounds like some exciting stuff coming up in the coming months, and I'm pleased to be here to talk about FAR Part 12 and commercial item acquisitions. We can go to the agenda on the next slide. Just to tick through that real quick, we're going to hit a really high-level overview of government procurements, talk about the distinction between commercial items and non-commercial item procurements. And just to note, the definition of commercial item is now bifurcated in the FAR. So FAR 2.101 now has a definition for commercial services and commercial products separately, but it's generally the same, and you often hear people just continue to use the term commercial item. We'll touch on the statutory preference for the federal government to buy commercial items and the need for the government to confirm that the price they're paying is fair and reasonable. And there's some nuance on that we'll touch on as well. Talk briefly about some of the standard FAR clauses and the ability to tailor them. Not all of them can be tailored, but in some cases you can. And then we'll briefly hit on some intellectual property and license considerations when contracting on a commercial item basis, and then some real brief comments on entering the contracting market. You can go to the next slide. So when you're doing business with the government, they're a different customer than any other customer you might sell to commercially. They generally have government unique requirements, and there can be enhanced risks when you're doing business with the government. So, the question is, why would a company that that has a pretty successful commercial business want to sell to the government? I think the answer is obvious. It's the large budgets, large dollars, and for all the cautionary tales that you might hear out there, that the government is a reliable payer. The government pays on time. Can there be disputes and other risks that come up? Of course, but generally speaking, it's a valuable customer to have and a lot of opportunity there. And where you see spending, it's everywhere. The government buys a wide range of products, from the simple and mundane cleaning products, office supplies, to the latest cutting edge technologies and the stealth fighters and nuclear submarines. But defense, IT, infrastructure, R&D, all those buckets. The focus today is on federal procurements, but let's not lose sight that there are significant state and local government budgets as well. California, I don't know exactly where they fall, but the last I looked, they were like the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world. So what I generally tell clients is that if you have a compliance system that complies with federal procurement requirements, that's generally going to get you maybe 80% of the way there for contracting with states. Every state is different, and unfortunately, I don't know if a good shortcut, a case-by-case assessment of the obligations is always appropriate, but there's going to be significant overlap with the federal contract and compliance requirements. And then most of the agencies have independent purchasing authority, so it can be a challenge to develop different relationships with each one, but that can also be an opportunity given the discretion and spending power that individual agencies have. And there's a number of different sales channels to consider. The government buys through competitive procurement oftentimes, but there's also sole source awards, set-asides. We'll talk about the federal supply schedule program, opportunities to subcontract as well. We can go on to the next slide. So again, a real high-level overview. Government contracts, they're generally highly regulated. When we're talking about FAR Part 12 commercial item contracting, it's more streamlined relative to government contracting. Relative to a commercial transaction, it's going to be more regulated. And there are accounting requirements. For example, for commercial item contractors, your standard accounting system should be sufficient. You shouldn't need your own separate government compliant accounting system. But there are some cautionary tales as well, and I'll touch on a recent case where in a termination for convenience context, a commercial item contractor was found to have an accounting system that was not sufficient to sort of track the costs and to claim the costs that they said they were entitled to. There's intellectual property issues around data rights and patent rights, equal opportunity reporting and compliance, socioeconomic requirements, and then record keeping, retention of records requirements that are important to keep in mind. And then, we talked about the risk. There's a risk in any commercial transaction that involves, payment of money. Is always the potential for disputes. When you have, when you're contracting with the sovereign and the counterparty is a government entity or the federal government, there's civil, administrative, and even criminal risk that can sit on top of that. So in terms of contract remedies, every government contract is going to be able to terminate for default. Contractors can be liable for excess reprocurement costs if the government needs to reprocure because of a termination for default. And I'd say that generally lines up with the remedies and penalties you might see in a commercial context. But with the government customer, you've also got, your past performance rating can take a hit. That can affect your ability to win new contracts in any number of contexts going forward. For, generally a CPAR will stay live for 3 years. False claims, that's one of the more significant penalties the government can bring. If there's overbillings, overpayment, sort of material non-compliance, while a contractor continues to submit invoices, there can be treble damages. Similarly with false statements. And then, false claims, if they're severe enough, can create suspension and debarment risk. Similar, a termination for default, if it's deemed to be willful, can give rise to suspension and debarment risk. So there's any number of risks out there with the government that you don't see, even in a commercial item context. And it's important to keep in mind some of the work I do is in the M&A context. And sometimes, if we're representing a buyer and the target company might say, well, we have a government contract, but it's, it's $100,000, so we really didn't pay too much attention to that. And the assumption is, well, sort of the upside liability exposure is the contract value. It's $100,000 or whatever the case may be. And as we've ticked through here in the government contract context, it can be significantly more than that. You can have false claims liability. You can get suspended or debarred for something that might happen under a low dollar contract. But again, I don't want to overstate the risk. I mean, the risk is certainly important, but I think the opportunity is there as well. And a lot of times when lawyers talk about compliance, I think sometimes we can be tone deaf and not always get the message across. And I think folks who attend training come away thinking either that somehow they got their hand slapped for not knowing something they should have known, or that they're putting the company at risk, or that they're going to go to jail. And so I think it's if you're in that position where you're implementing compliance in your organization, I really think it's important to strike that balance of empowering people rather than scaring them, and making sure that folks feel like they can do the right thing. a story that I tell sometimes is in a False Claims Act case that was, it was a $100 million issue. And in responding to a subpoena, we went through a bunch of correspondence and produced it to the government and came across one email where an employee had found that the government was being charged the incorrect rate. And it was like a $40,000 issue, which in the grand scheme was utterly meaningless. And the email exchange says, oh man, I found this mistake, do we need to correct it? And the response is, no, let's sweep it under the rug, let's see if they notice. And then the person responds, okay, great, have a nice weekend. And in hindsight, it's really easy to look back and say, well, that was the wrong choice, and it was. But I think organizationally, that person was in a scenario where they knew if they raised that issue, the response was not going to be, great, thanks for pointing that out. The response was going to be, are you kidding me? And it's not easy. I think if it were easy, everybody would be doing it. But it's really important organizationally to have a culture where folks feel empowered to do the right thing and know what the rules are. Sorry to belabor that point. We can move on to the next slide and get into it a little bit. So the compliance obligations are going to vary by contract type. So, generally a commercial item, as I said earlier, it's bifurcated now. So there's commercial product, commercial service definition, but it's an item of a type, and that's sort of a term of art. So it doesn't have to be exactly what's sold commercially, but an item of a type that's sold commercially to the general public, to non-governmental entities for purposes other than governmental purposes. So that's a broad definition, and it's meant to be, and many vendors who sell commercially, all have a product that will also meet government requirements. And so in terms of the FAR, we mentioned FAR Part 12, and that's where the commercial item procedures are set forth. FAR Part 8 includes the procedures for the Federal Supply Schedule program. So you'll often see FAR Part 8 in the context of commercial item acquisitions as well. And then non-commercial, as the name suggests, it's more of a tailored sort of government unique item or service that's more specific to the government needs, that's not available commercially. And usually that's FAR Part 15 procedures that you see in that context. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. So an important point is the government is required by statute, a long-standing statute going back 30 years, to buy commercial items where there's a commercial item that meets the government's requirements. And it's more than that. I think a lot of times government buyers will stop there and say, well, is there a commercial item? Yes or no? Okay, I've done my work. The statute requires more. The statute says if there's not a commercial item, then you've got to look to see, can a commercial item be modified readily to meet the government's requirements? And then there's another step that if it can't be modified, then the government's obliged by statute to consider, can my requirements be changed so that I can change my requirements so that I can meet them with the commercial item? And only if you get through those three steps and the answer is no, 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 then they can buy a non-commercial item. So, under the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, any new procurement law that's passed since October 1994 by statute does not apply to commercial item contracting, except in one of three cases where the statute says specifically that it applies, or where the statute provides for civil or criminal penalties, or where the FAR Council makes a written determination that it's in the government's best interest that it apply. So that third exception over time has subsumed the rule a little bit. So you'll see that, and there's been a lot written about this, that commercial item contractors increasingly face a higher and higher compliance burden. And the federal government through the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, has made some efforts to compel the federal executive agencies to sort of scale that compliance burden back. I think it's fair to say it's been met with some pushback, but that sort of tension is ongoing. I'll mention here just one case from 2016. The company was Palantir Technologies, had a commercial, we'll just call it a data analytics platform, and the Marine Corps decided to buy a platform and pay for it to be developed with new funding. And Palantir protested that solicitation and said, no, you can't do that. You have to buy commercially. And there was some question as to whether does FASA, the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, really have teeth? Can you really force the government to do that? And it wasn't an easy road. It went to the Court of Federal Claims. The government appealed it to the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. And ultimately the contractor was successful. And the agency was told, no, you have to buy commercial in this.
Hi, Chris.
So there is.
It's Jennifer Schaus. You had contacted us in regards to.
Jennifer, you're not on mute. Thanks. So at any rate, so the FAFSA does have some teeth. It's not often tested like that, but there are some teeth there. The commerciality determination is made by the contracting officer, and the advantages, the intent is for commercial item contractors not to have to change their standard operating procedures. I think reality is they're going to have to, but the hope is it's around the edges and not significant. So we can go to the next slide there. So, the government in every context needs to confirm at some level that the price it's paying for a product or service is fair and reasonable. And that requirement sometimes gets conflated with the commercial item sort of commerciality determination. So oftentimes, if there's competition, if there are significant sales to the general public, it gets easier to do some sort of a comparison for the government to get assurances that it's paying a fair and reasonable price. When that's not the case and it becomes a little more challenging to confirm price reasonableness, that's when sometimes you'll see government agencies will question, well, is it a commercial item then if we can't readily confirm reasonable? And that's a separate analysis, and there is this tendency to conflate those issues. But so this is a requirement under FAR 13, that's simplified acquisition procedures, 14, which is sealed bidding, or 15, which is the negotiated procurement. And so if you have adequate price competition, the resulting award is deemed to have a fair and reasonable price. Absent that, the government for commercial items is required to do a price analysis as opposed to a cost analysis. And oftentimes government agencies will default to that cost analysis, meaning I want to see your cost buildup. I want to see what your actual cost of goods, overhead, profit, et cetera is, and then I'll determine if that price is fair and reasonable. That's the last resort. You can look at commercial prices previously, previous proposals or items that the government's purchased, other benchmarks, yardsticks, parametric pricing techniques, or independent government estimates. So that data, other than certified cost or pricing data, the cost buildup information that commercial item contractors really, in very rare cases, should they provide that. And again, there's tension. I mean, I think there's a view inside government agencies, and I'll say in my view, particularly DoD, where there's this idea that if I'm not getting that cost buildup data, that somehow the contractor is getting one over on me. And that's not what the regulations say. That's not what the law says. But I think there is that attitude there sometimes that contractors need to overcome. And there have been cases, I'll just mention quickly, where the DoD IG, the Office of the Inspector General, has used their subpoena power to get cost data from contractors after the fact to determine what their profitability rate was, and then to scrutinize the contracting agencies over that, to say, hey, you should have done better here. And I really think that just turns the commercial item pricing regime on its head, the commercial item contracting regime on its head. We can go to the next slide. All right, great. So there are some standard clauses. Like I said, this is streamlined for federal contracting, but there are some standard FAR clauses to be aware of that we'll take through. Not everyone, just a couple of highlights. We can go to the next slide. So the standard terms and conditions applicable to commercial item contracts are found at FAR 52.212-4. So, if you're familiar with the FAR, you see policy and the prescriptions in parts 1 through 51, and it covers all kinds of areas, including commercial items in FAR Part 12. So when you see 52.212, that tells you that this is prescribed in FAR Part 12. And so, these are a lot of the terms and conditions you would see in a commercial item context. And I'm not going to go through every one of these, but to note, like in C, that the changes clause in a commercial item contract, changes require mutual agreement of the parties. So that's distinct from a non-commercial item contract. The disputes clause, I'd say that's one that is more akin to a non-commercial item government contract. Disputes are still subject to the Contract Disputes Act. We'll talk about warranty in a little bit, I think, on the next slide. The limitation of liability in letter P there, I'll note, Under commercial item contracts, consequential damages are carved out, but there's not a cap on direct damages. And sometimes that's a point that creates a lot of consternation for government contractors who are used to some sort of a limit or a cap on liability. And I understand the concern. Over the years, I think it's fair to say there have not been a lot of cases where the government has made an example out of a contractor, or a contractor has been burned by that lack of a cap. Again, never want to say never, or that we couldn't find a case that had sort of a bad set of facts or a bad outcome for the contractor. But generally speaking, that has not been overly problematic for government contractors. And then I'll just note the reference to the CCR, I apologize, is outdated. It is now sam.gov, the System for Award Management.gov. But at any rate, these are the general provisions that you'll see in 212-4. We can go on to the next slide. So every government contract is going to have a termination for convenience right. The sort of broad policy thinking behind that is that you're contracting with the sovereign. The sovereign has any number of priorities and obligations. If those priorities change, the government needs the flexibility to change those, the use of those resources. But contractors are, they're not going to be entitled to costs that they could have avoided reasonably after it was terminated, but costs that are reasonably unavoidable, they'd be entitled to recover after a termination for convenience. And we talked about accounting requirements a little bit earlier. So the contractor in a commercial item context is not required to comply with CAS, the cost accounting standards. But you do need to have some semblance of a contracting system. I'm sorry, of an accounting system. And there was that case, ACLR versus the U.S. at the Court of Federal Claims, where a contractor submitted a claim after a termination for convenience, and their accounting system and system of records was just too rudimentary for the court, and the court found that it wasn't adequate and they were not entitled to the amount they were seeking. That's been appealed to the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, and so we'll see what the result is. I think it created some concern in the commercial item contracting community that it was perhaps too high of a standard, because they did have records. It was just, the court determined that they weren't adequate. And then again, termination for cause. Anytime there's a material default, the government has that right if it's not cured. And the government's not going to be liable for any supplies or services that they don't accept, even if they're delivered. And there could be any number of liabilities the contractor faces in this context, and we've touched on some of them. But it could get to a suspension or debarment scenario if the termination for default, if the default is deemed to be willful. So we can go to the next slide. So warranty, I just want to touch on that. A lot of times in the commercial context, the company selling the commercial item, whatever it is, their position is, this is my product. It does what it does. If you want to buy it, that's great. But I don't know what you want to use it for, and I can't promise you that it's going to be the right product for whatever you buy it for. And so you see that come out in the warranty language sometimes in terms of the as is. The government standard warranty language retains this implied warranty of merchantability and fitness for a particular purpose. So that can create some tension, and it can be troubling for contractors to accept. Again, I'll say similar to the lack of a cap on direct damages, there are not numerous examples of contractors getting burned by this. This, seems to be seems to work itself out, but this is language that can give some contractors pause, and I think I just don't know of a silver bullet to get around that, but but know that it's not a case where contractors have seen significant liability, but it's important to focus on nonetheless. We can go ahead to the next slide. This can be a quick one, but even in the commercial item contracting scenario, there's requirements and statutes that might not apply commercially. And this isn't going to be everyone, but some of the big ones. If the government doesn't have appropriated funds, they can't carry out the contract. Similarly, and this is the first bullet, contractors cannot lobby the government with appropriated funds to influence certain federal contracts. So that still leaves a lot of latitude, for proper lobbying efforts. Government contractors do employ lobbyists and do lobby, but they've got to be careful that they're not using funds from government contracts to do that. And it's important to pay attention to the specific certifications that might be required, whether it's in your SAM.gov profile or with a specific contract, just to make sure you're compliant. Title 18 is the criminal code. Government officials can't benefit from contracts. The next bullet, certain labor laws that contractors need to abide by. Kickbacks, sort of the quintessential kickback scenario is a subcontractor or a supplier who's giving some sort of gift or gratuity to a prime contractor for favorable treatment under a contract. It's important to have proper compliance processes, procedures in place to avoid that. Whistleblower protections, you can't retaliate against whistleblowers, and that sounds intuitive, and that sounds like the right approach. I think the challenge that companies find sometimes is, there's a problematic employee who's facing some sort of discipline, and they are clever enough to find something to blow the whistle on and to claim whistleblower protections, sort of more as a shield rather than, as sort of a way to do the right thing. And then the Procurement Integrity Act, can certainly apply to government officials. Sharing source selection sensitive information can also apply to contractors getting improperly receiving source selection information, from competitors or otherwise. So, some high level statutory compliance obligations to be aware of. We can go to the next slide. So 52212-5, the terms and conditions required to implement statutes and executive orders. If you see this one, a lot of these clauses will have checks next to them, and the contracting officer will put a check or an X to indicate which applies, which doesn't. I think there's an effort underway to automate that so that you don't have an individual checking boxes with inconsistent results sometimes. But these first two bullets are relatively new requirements that have gotten some attention. The first one, prohibition on contracting for certain telecom equipment. That's commonly called the Huawei ban, where government contractors at the prime level can't use any of those items in their organization, whether it has any connection or not to the government contracts they're performing, and certainly can't deliver them to the government. ByteDance, if you have that on your phone and you're using it to perform a government contract or receive government information, that can be an issue there. And then the long-standing one, equal opportunity. Every government contract is going to have some level of equal opportunity, affirmative action plan requirements that are important to keep an eye on. And then the flow down scenario, I think it's important to keep this in mind from both perspectives, from both the prime and the sub. I think from the prime's perspective, they want to get as many requirements from their prime into those lower tier contracts just to make sure that they're aligned. But there really is a limit. They're not supposed to flow down just every clause, especially to a commercial item subcontractor. There's a limited set of required flow downs. And oftentimes those negotiations just turn on leverage, and I know it can be difficult from a subcontractor's perspective to tell an 800-pound gorilla, sort of a large prime contractor, that that they're not going to accept certain clauses. But the takeaway here is that there are principled rules and regulations to point to in trying to limit the flow down obligations from a subcontractor's point of view. And whether the prime contract is a contract for commercial items or not for commercial items, there's different prescribed flow downs. But in both cases, it's a limited set of required flow downs to commercial item subcontractors. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. I mentioned earlier how Congress has tried to sort of scale back some of the compliance burdens on commercial item contractors. There's a proposed rule right now that would make certain laws and regulations inapplicable to commercial items, and it changes, and this is in the DFARS, so it's applicable in a DoD contracting setting, not all government contracts. But whereas the language in terms of flow downs used to say that the prime is not required to flow down clauses unless certain requirements apply, it now says they shall not. So again, there's a principled basis to point to in those negotiations to try to limit that flow down obligation. I think there's some question about how enforceable is that. Is the flow down police or whatever other enforcement authority going to show up to sort of mediate those issues? My sense is probably no, but there could be certain scenarios where the government could get involved to help get a reasonable result. And then just to touch on the GSA has consolidated some of the economic price adjustment clauses, trying to make it easier for contractors to escalate prices. I think that's a nod to sort of the inflationary times that we've been experiencing. We can go to the next slide. So the commercial item clauses can be tailored. So FAR Part 12 provides that the government can tailor or change their standard commercial clauses consistent with commercial item practices or commercial practices. Again, not every clause can be tailored. So some are required by statute. So if you say to the government, I don't want our disputes to be governed by the Contract Disputes Act. I want it to be, Maryland law, Virginia law, whatever the case may be. They're not going to be able to accept that. But other terms and conditions, they do have discretion to tailor. And if it's an issue, it's something you can bring up. We should keep expectations measured. I think it's generally challenging to convince the government to deviate from their standard language. I think government employees often perceive risk to themselves when they do that if something goes wrong, that it sort of puts them in a risk posture. But it's certainly a reasonable request, and if you can get the government to do it, it could have some benefits. Okay, we can go to the next slide. I said briefly I'd just touch on intellectual property issues. When we think about intellectual property, we're looking at rights and data. So of course it's important to be diligent about asserting your rights and data at the front end of the contract. Anything that was developed at private expense, you want to assert those rights, make clear that that data is either subject to limited rights or maybe a commercial license agreement. Patents is another issue, but any patent that's newly realized in performance of a government contract, there's certain notification requirements that would apply. You may not often see that in performing a commercial item contract, but understand that there are specific rules that apply for data rights and patent rights. And I wanted to touch just briefly on this language from FAR Part 12 that requires the government to use the standard license when it's buying commercial computer software and commercial computer software documentation. So that means if you have a commercial software product, generally you have a standard license, whether you call it a EULA and user license agreement or something else. The government's required to accept that. Now that said, the government's not required to accept every piece of it. There are certain items that the government may not be able to accept by statute. So it's typical and customary for the government to tailor those EULAs and to take out the items it can't accept. So, I think the one you hear the most about is indemnities. The government under the Anti-Deficiency Act cannot incur an obligation if there hasn't been an appropriation. So if you have an indemnity obligation in your EULA, the government would take exception to that. Governing law, again, the government's not going to accept state law. It would be federal law. Other things that you see a lot of times, licenses will have like auto renewals or auto updates, where the company can just sort of change the terms on their website, and that applies to all their contracts. For the government, you'd have to execute a modification for those modifications to take effect. Unilateral remedies, the government's also going to take exception to. A lot of licenses will say, if you don't comply with the terms, we can shut off your access. The government's going to say, no, you've got to make a claim under the Contract Disputes Act and resolve it that way. So there could be some back and forth, but understand that the starting point should be the standard commercial license agreement and not some other standard government license grant when we're talking about commercial computer software. All right, we can go on to the next and last slide. Entering the government contracting market. So, as legal counsel, I don't often get involved in sort of the marketing and strategy issues. I think some of the sponsors that Jennifer mentioned at the top of the hour may be good for that. But understand if you're thinking about getting into the market, it's a long-term investment. It generally is not sort of a quick return. It can pay great dividends, but it generally takes some time and investment to realize those benefits. sometimes contractors will wrestle with questions: do I need a separate government entity? Do I need a separate legal entity to do business with the government? And it depends, but generally the answer is no, you don't. There's organizations, very large organizations, who do not have a separate dedicated government entity. Oftentimes the issues that drive that decision are if you have a requirement for a government unique accounting requirements, or if you have security clearance, cleared personnel, and if you have any level of foreign ownership to help mitigate, they call it FOCI, foreign ownership control or interest. Sometimes it makes sense to have that everything housed in a separate legal entity. But absent that, oftentimes you see companies who do not have a separate dedicated entity. There's trade-offs and sort of costs and benefits, so it's always a case-by-case assessment. But understand it's not a requirement by any means. And there are existing contract vehicles. I mentioned FAR Part 8 in the Federal Supply Schedule program. That's a commercial item program where government agencies can buy off of those schedule contracts, and that's an evergreen solicitation. So you don't need, there's not like a deadline to submit your proposal. It's always open, and your pricing is going to be determined up front. So if it gets listed on the schedule, that price is already deemed by the government to be fair and reasonable. Government buyers can always seek a discount off of those ceiling prices in the GSA schedule program, but that's a powerful tool for government contractors to have to market to the government, and gives federal executive agencies a really streamlined way to purchase those products without conducting a new procurement from the beginning. Buying off the schedule is generally a much more streamlined way to buy for government buyers. And then there's any number of other vehicles that are out there. I've just listed a few. The NITAC is an NIH IT vehicle, the STARS 3 GWAC government-wide acquisition contract, again for IT services for 8A companies, and then for veteran-owned or service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, the VETS 2 GWAC is out there. And there's also subcontracting opportunities. There's opportunities to list if you don't want to go through the investment and effort of getting your own GSA schedule contract or whatever the case may be, or NASA soup. There are third parties that will list third-party products on their contract. There's a number of those companies out there. I don't want to mention any specific. I don't want to seem like I'm endorsing anyone. There's a number of good ones out there. Again, there's cost benefits, pluses and minuses to consider for your specific situation, but just know that that's an option of listing your product or service on a third party's government acquisition vehicle. So, just to wrap up, there's lots of opportunity out there. The FAR Part 12 provides a streamlined process for commercial item products and services to be sold to the government. There's still a compliance burden to pay attention to. There's still risks out there with doing business with the government. So make sure you do the assessment that's right for you. And my contact information is in the materials, so certainly feel free to reach out to me. That's the older picture. I think we had the newer picture at the beginning, but you get to see me about 18 years ago there. But anyway, feel free to reach out if there's any questions. And Jennifer, back over to you, but thanks to everybody for your time and attention.
Sam, this was great. Thanks so much. We really appreciate your time. The content was very well organized, and I apologize for the audio hiccup there. Thanks everybody for joining us. And if you do have questions about FAR Part 12, Sam is your go-to person. You've got his contact information here. You can also find him on LinkedIn, as well as on their on the law firm website of DLA Piper. On Friday this week, we'll cover FAR Part 13, and then next week is 14 and 15. So we're just going sequentially down the list. All of the recordings will be on our website, usually within 24 hours, sometimes sooner. So check our website under the FAR for the recordings as well as the registration. And I think that will do it for us today. Again, if you also subscribe to our YouTube channel, which doesn't cost you anything except 5 seconds of your time, you'll get the alert as soon as this webinar from today has been uploaded. In the event that you're watching this on YouTube, give us a like, leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you, and hope that you'll continue to subscribe to our channel. So thanks again, everybody, for your time. Thanks, Sam, and we'll see you on Friday.
Right. Thanks, all.